nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Shaz Chidolo.
This week, one Democratic governor is about to resign, another may be about to get kicked out. We'll speak to a former governor who's kind of been there and done that.
And it's the economy, stupid. As Biden zeroes in on another big spending deal, unemployment's down and the economy's picking up.
Also this week, I'll sit down with one of President Obama's former top foreign policy advisors, Ben Rhodes.
And I'm going to have a COVID update as the kids head back to school from summer break. But first...
In a rare show of bipartisanship, this week the United States Senate overwhelmingly passed an infrastructure bill worth around $1.2 trillion, including $550 billion in brand new spending, with 19 Republicans voting with the Democrat majority.
For the Republicans who supported this bill, you showed a lot of courage. And I want to personally thank you for that. And I've called most of you on the phone to do just that. You have, and no doubt you will, disagree with me on many issues. But where we can agree, we should. And here on this bill, we prove that we can still come together to do big things, important things for the American people.
Passing the Senate with a more than filibuster-proof 60 votes is a major achievement, and if the Democrats wanted to, they could move this straight to the House of Representatives for a vote right away, and it'd be on Biden's desk to sign into law lickety-split. So, how about it, Speaker Nancy Pelosi?
No, I said very clearly, this is Build Back Better. The president has said he has a vision, and we share that vision. And it's about building back better. So whatever you can achieve in a bipartisan way, bravo. We salute it, we applaud it, we hope that it will pass soon. But at the same time, we're not going forward with leaving people behind.
By which Speaker Pelosi means all of the stuff that Democrats wanted in the infrastructure bill that wouldn't get Republican support, what they called human infrastructure, things like childcare and funding for in-home carers. So, she and progressive Democrats in the House say that they won't vote on the bipartisan bill until the Senate also sends them a $3.5 trillion budget bill, which Democrats will then try and pass with a simple majority through reconciliation. Well, Republican Senator John Thune is not happy about that.
If you look at what the House of Representatives is saying, is they're saying, well, you can't move one without the other. So essentially, Nancy Pelosi is saying, I'm going to hold hostage the bipartisan bill until I can get my $3.5 trillion reckless tax and spending spree bill voted on in the House of Representatives, which I think, ironically, is what makes the American people so cynical about Washington, D.C.
Well, it is kind of a hostage situation. He's right. Now the infrastructure bill is with the House. This is no longer about bipartisanship anymore. It is about keeping Democratic Senate moderates like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema on the same page as progressives in the House, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. And that is Nancy Pelosi's job now. If she does it, it'll be the biggest achievement of her career, as well as probably Joe Biden's career, Chaz.
I still can't quite believe it happened, John, at least so far. First, the budget scorekeepers, the CBO, they came out last week, they said this supposedly fully paid for bill actually had spending and revenue provisions that added up to minus $256 billion, with even worse, an overall bottom line of a $340 billion deficit. And if that wasn't enough to sink the bill, then Trump came out and dive-bombed the whole thing, saying Joe Biden's infrastructure bill is a disgrace. It will be very hard for me to endorse anyone foolish enough to vote in favour of this deal. Now, that threat did clearly spook out some Republicans, with Todd Young, Jerry Moran and Mike Rounds all hightailing it out of the red zone. But others pretty much told Trump to buzz off.
It will be very hard for me to endorse anyone foolish enough to vote in favor of this deal. And you say?
Well, he didn't give one reason why it's a bad deal, other than it's Joe Biden's. There's some nearly 200 organizations that have come out in support of this bill. We need roads and bridges. We're falling behind our competitors, particularly China, with regard to transportation infrastructure. It is what moves goods and services around the world. So I think he's wrong on this
recognize there's
issue.
a lot of support for this.
The Republican senator said Trump was wrong. Hang on. I'm awake. Look, these were the 19 Republicans who ended up voting for it, including a lot of the usual moderate suspects like Susan Collins and Mitt Romney, but also Mitch McConnell. Even Trump family pet Lindsey Graham voted for it. And Biden was absolutely loving it.
This bill shows that we can work together. I know a lot of people, some sitting in the audience here, didn't think this could happen. That bipartisanship was a thing of the past. As you may well remember, I never believed that, and I still don't.
Okay, so why did the Republicans do it? Some say they wanted some goodies to bring home to constituents. Some say they just love infrastructure. Some say they were looking to undermine the push to end the filibuster. But it's hard to go past the polls. Funding roads, bridges and ports, polls are 83% support, with 79% approval from Republicans and 87% approval from Democrats. Regardless, the Senate has already begun the process of putting together the reconciliation bill, and as John said, this could be huge. We're talking universal pre-kindergarten, free community college, dental, hearing and vision support for Medicare, federal family and medical leave, long-term home care for those who need it, dreamers and potentially more people being fully legalised, a whole stack of climate initiatives and making a number of pandemic stimulus provisions permanent. That is quite a list, JB. But just to remind us that the battle has started anew, Joe Manchin immediately noted that he has serious concerns about the grave consequences if Congress spends another $3.5 trillion. And Kirsten Sinema agrees with him, saying she also does not support a bill that costs $3.5 trillion. Needless to say, the Democrats need both of those votes. So we'll see what happens there over the next few months.
Yeah, well, Republicans got the infrastructure bill cut in half in $1 cents. Sinema and Manchin may do the same with this bill as well. But ultimately, this is all happening, I reckon, because at the moment both sides think they're winning. It's the same reason why two sides tend to go to war. They think there is an advantage in all of this. Republicans can get the infrastructure, which, as you say, is popular, and at the same time they can say, but we're the fiscally responsible ones. And we'll find out who's right in the midterms next November on that calculation. Meanwhile, millions of American school students headed back to the classroom this week, but the return to in-person learning is looking a lot dicier in the face of the Delta surge than it did 2 months ago when the long summer break began. In California, they have already had over 4 million COVID cases and almost 65,000 deaths. That's in a state population of just a shade under 40 million. The state has strict indoor mask mandates for all public school teachers, school workers and students. And this week, Governor Gavin Newsom announced education workers would now have to show proof of vaccination or take regular COVID tests.
All of our staff, not just teachers, credentialed staff, paraeducators, custodial staff, the bus drivers, folks that are critical to supporting the entire school ecosystem, also submit a verification of vaccination and or submit to weekly testing.
This brings California's schools into line with an existing mandate for all health workers, but things are a little bit different down in Florida, where Republican governor and potential presidential candidate Ron DeSantis is banning schools from imposing mask mandates.
The governor said he would not stop any parent from having their own child wear a mask, but he did say schools that impose mask mandates risk losing state funding.
Not only that, but DeSantis is threatening to withhold the salary of any Florida school board member or school superintendent who mandates mask wearing. The Biden administration is now looking at ways of stepping in to pay them. Instead, DeSantis says he's worried about the kids who are uncomfortable wearing a mask.
So our view is, of course, that we believe this is a decision for the parent to make, just given the uncertainty about what it means, particularly for a lot of the young kids to be in that. And I think that's where the vast majority of the districts, I know we have, I think, two who are not providing the parents with the rights, but obviously we believe that the parent, rather than the government, should ultimately be able to make that decision.
But White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki says it is Governor DeSantis who is getting in the way of expert public health advice.
If you're not interested in following the public health guidelines to protect the lives of people in your state, to give parents some comfort as they're sending their kids to school. Schools are opening in Florida this week, I know, in many parts of Florida. Then get out of the way and let public officials, let local officials do their job to keep students safe.
And they're not stopping at fighting DeSantis with the zingers either, John. They're considering coming over the top of him with their own impositions.
Presidential powers to intervene in states like Texas and Florida where they are banning mask mandates?
I don't believe that I do thus far. We're checking that.
Yeah, don't think that's going to cut it. But in the meantime, some Florida schools are taking matters into their own hands. At least 2 school districts are happy to take the penalty and stand by their mask mandates. One superintendent wrote that even before their holidays ended, they'd had more cases reported in the past 2 weeks than the previous 5 months combined. 2 of their employees died from COVID-related complications just over a week ago, and many others were quarantined or unable to work, leaving the district on the verge of not having the staff to be able to operate their schools safely. That's a pretty sympathetic situation for DeSantis to insert himself into, especially given he's already suffered a setback in court from a judge that placed an injunction on Florida's mandate bans, courtesy of a cruise liner that demands proof of vaccination to board. Now, DeSantis will appeal that ruling, so we'll see where that goes. But 2 judges in Texas have also allowed injunctions against a similar rule for schools in Texas. So I suspect this question is going to end up in the Supreme Court. DeSantis, he's not taking any chances though. He's providing private school vouchers for parents who object to public school mask mandates. They've essentially reinvented the Hope Scholarship for bullying, and they've added COVID-19 harassment as a prohibited form of discrimination. A little weird, but okay. Unfortunately, all this cat and mouse strategizing, it's not about a game, with Florida leading the country for hospitalised children with COVID. There are 172 of them at the moment and rising. But Ron DeSantis says it's all under control.
If you look throughout the entire pandemic, between 1.1 and 1.4% of COVID positive patients in Florida hospitals have been pediatrics. And right now it's 1.3%. So you've not seen a change in the proportion of the young people who end up being admitted.
Firstly, I'm not sure that's accurate on a national basis, with 216 American children being hospitalised with COVID a day, matching the peaks in January when cases and hospitalisations for the general community were twice what they are now. Secondly, even if the children's hospitalisations do stay in proportion with everyone else, well, then the more cases and hospitalisations you've got, the more you've got a problem. So check out Florida's daily cases, setting new records every day. In fact, if Louisiana and Florida were countries, they would be the number 1 and 2 countries in the world for COVID cases per capita. As for hospitalisations, in Florida, they're not looking too flash either. Get this, there are about 71 hospitalisations per 100,000 Floridians at the moment, which slightly exceeds the mark set by New York back at the beginning of the pandemic when they had completely lost control. Although, importantly, at that point in time, New York had about 10 times as many deaths as Florida does today. Actually, Florida, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oregon have all got more people hospitalised currently than at any other stage of the pandemic. But I've saved the worst for last, ICUs. At the peak of the Delta wave in the UK, there were 13 COVID patients per million in British ICUs. There are now more than 10 times that many COVID patients in ICUs in Louisiana and Arkansas, and over 9 times that many in Florida, Mississippi, Missouri, and Alabama. Now, some of you eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that every state on that graphic is red. And you might suspect that low vaccination rates could be the issue. Now, for most of those states, maybe. But here's the odd thing. Florida vaccinations are dead on the national average, about 50% of the population. Yet, if you put where they should be on a cases graph based on their vaccination rate, that's the red dot, in reality, Florida actually has 3 times that many cases. Similarly, they have 4 times as many hospitalisations as you'd expect from their vaccination rate, and 2.5 times as many deaths as you'd expect from their vaccination rate. So what is going on there? Ron DeSantis says it's seasonal, that when it's hot, people in Florida stay indoors and catch COVID.
You're going to start to see winter and fall waves in the northern states. And, we have a summer season, but you're going to see that. And so I think that that's something that should be stressed more and more.
So if he's right, then what we're seeing in Florida and Louisiana is going to be coming to northern states real soon. All the more reason to get vaccinated.
Yeah, a lot of old folks in air conditioning. Maybe if they were just wearing a mask, Governor, it would help. Either way, America's 2 million active duty military personnel are going to be required to get the COVID-19 vaccine, with Pentagon leaders saying that the vaccine is a necessary step to maintain military readiness. Around 70% of military personnel have had at least one COVID shot already, and they are required to get as many as 17 different vaccines. So this is not unusual. It's unclear, though, what is going to happen to the personnel who continue to refuse. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby, though, had this message this week.
This is coming, and we want you to be ready for it as well. And obviously, we'd prefer that that you get the vaccine now and not wait for the mandate.
The Food and Drug Administration, meanwhile, is expected to give complete approval for the Pfizer vaccine next month, rather than the emergency authorisation that it's been operating under for more than 8 months around the world. And that is expected to be kind of a legal trigger point when more federal mandates will then go into force. You have to get a vaccine. In the private sector, large employers like United Airlines have already given their 67,000 employees an ultimatum: get vaccinated by the end of October or face getting fired. Although 3 rival airlines are taking a different route to that, saying they're not requiring unvaccinated employees to get the shot. Earlier today, the United States Supreme Court refused to overturn a University of Indiana vaccine mandate. Now, that is not a precedent that's going to affect these other things, because basically Amy Coney Barrett said, we're not going to hear it. This is not legally sound. Federal health workers will also be compelled to get the jab, but plenty of private sector health workers are still protesting against any idea of a vaccine mandate in their workplace, including hundreds of hospital staff this week in Tucson, Arizona.
Many healthcare workers at the protest expressed they would walk if they were forced to get the vaccine or lose employment. Richard Abbott is one of them.
I'm not getting the vaccine. If I can get some sort of exemption, I will do that. If I can't get it, I will have to seek employment elsewhere.
Good luck to whoever works with Richard next.
Look, Richard can protest, but people are only becoming less patient with the unvaccinated in America, and that will intensify once the vaccines are formally approved, like you say, John. Like I said a few times on this show, that should be a big period for vaccination. The advertising starts then as well. It's either going to happen then or not at all.
Yeah. I'm not particularly confident either way on that bet. No. Let's head back to California, though, because Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom there is basically fighting for his political life at the moment. Next month, he will face a recall election. And opinion polls suggest he is in a lot of danger of losing his job. A recall petition against Governor Newsom gathered 1.7 million signatures. That was fueled by discontent over his handling of the coronavirus pandemic there. Lots of stay-at-home orders and lots of businesses were shuttered there as well, Chaz.
You're not wrong about Newsom's handling of COVID, John. Survey USA asked people who wanted to recall Newsom why they wanted to recall him. And while only 34% said it was because of his handling of COVID restrictions, look at the highlighted sections there. Really, 61% of the answers were COVID related. This COVID spike is not helping Newsom at all.
So, California voters are now going to be asked 2 questions. First, do they want to recall Governor Newsom? And if the majority vote yes to that, then he's out. He's eliminated, he's removed from office, and it goes to the second question, who asks the voters who would they like to replace him? And there are a long list of potential rivals, a bunch of Republicans, some Greens, some Libertarians, and a handful of fairly obscure Democrats. Newsom is a Democrat. Now, under this peculiar system, the next governor could win with maybe 25, 30% of the overall vote. Now, every registered voter is getting a mail-in ballot in the post at the moment. Last week, a poll from KABC showed the governor in strife, 51% saying, yep, get rid of him. Just 40% saying, no, let's keep him. Although that poll does have a 5-point margin of error. An earlier poll from Emerson had Newsom hanging on by just 2 points. Either way, it's a squeaker, Chaz.
It certainly is, and the decisive group might end up being Hispanics. In that Emerson poll you just cited, the margin was only 2%, right? But Hispanics support recalling Newsom 54% to 41%, which is quite interesting. Although bottom line, this is going to come down to just how much Democrats can be bothered to save Newsom. I mean, there are so many more Democrats in California than Republicans, but an LA Times poll found 80% of Republican voters said they were certain to vote, compared to only 55% of Democrats, and about half of independents. So you might find Newsom undertaking increasingly desperate acts, like personally cleaning up homeless shelters over the next month or so.
Maybe he was just auditioning for his next job there by the looks of that. Now let's find out some more about this rather weird recall election process. Former California Democratic Governor Gray Davis, he knows what it's like to face a recall election and lose. He was defeated in 2003 and replaced with the top Republican candidate, this guy.
Get to the chopper!
Governor Gray Davis, welcome to Planet America.
My pleasure. Good to be with you, John.
So explain this funny system that you've got going there in California, where an incumbent governor can be recalled, go to an election, get 49.99% of the vote and lose the governorship, and somebody who gets maybe 20 or 30% becomes governor.
The answer is nobody knows. It's clearly unfair that a governor has to get 50% plus 1 vote on question number 1. That is, should we retain the governor, yes or no? Question number 2, where the governor cannot participate, all the other candidates run, and whoever gets the most votes. You don't have to get 50%, you don't have to get 40%, you don't have to get 30%, you just have to get more votes than anyone else. I think that's unfair. Now, when I ran for office, I didn't complain about it. Those were the rules. Those are the rules in this election. But I think going forward, policymakers in Sacramento ought to think about saying we should have 1 question on the ballot. All the candidates that qualified should run. The governor should run. Whoever gets the most votes gets to fill out the remainder of the governor's term.
So, Gray Davis, unlike your situation, Gavin Newsom does not have an Arnold Schwarzenegger running against him, but the polls aren't looking great for him right now. So how worried should he be?
I think this election is there for Gavin Newsom to win. I think he will win. And I think he has one challenge, which is to let people know there is an election on September 8th. Don't usually have elections on September 8th. That's only 8 days after Labor Day. But all they have to do is fill out the ballot that will automatically be sent to them, vote no on the first question, and mail it back in. They don't have to go to the polls and worry about catching COVID from someone. They can do it in the privacy of their home. But it is an important election because it will change the direction of the government pretty dramatically.
And in your recall election in 2003, there was a prominent Democrat in Lieutenant Governor Bustamante who was on that second ballot once you were recalled. This time, though, Democrats have not put forward anyone of any prominence. They're really putting all their chips on Gavin Newsom holding on that first ballot. So is that strategically a better move?
I think the Democrats are right to consolidate their forces. There's no reason to vote anything but no on the recall and to make sure Gavin Newsom gets to finish the job that people of California elected him to perform. There's an election next June, which the top 2 vote getters, regardless of their party, get to run against each other in November for another 4-year term. This is a recall, like throwing a wrench in a factory, stopping all the machinery. And in this case, I think the burden should be on the challengers to say why things are so dire that only they can step in and fix the problem.
Finally, Governor, when you were defeated, you were recalled and then replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. That was really sort of the progenitor of the superstar celebrity candidate, Governor Schwarzenegger, leading, some would argue, straight to Donald Trump. How do you feel about that? A celebrity candidate's a good or a bad thing for politics?
Well, running against them is bad. Let me attest to that. I mean, he was Mr. Universe. He had some legislative initiatives, he got passed having to do with after-school funding. Married to Maria Shriver, was part of the Kennedy family. There's not too many people that fit that bill. on planet Earth, much less in this race. There's no one in this race. So celebrities, I think, are the most important asset you can bring to a campaign today. I think Trump got elected in part because people felt they knew him after seeing him on television for 14 years. Same thing with Arnold and the Terminator movies and the other movies he made. And that's very hard to fight with, because you start saying, well, he's really doesn't have the same policies that you care about. And he said, well, no, we know Trump, we know Arnold, they're good people, we're voting for them. So that's a very powerful asset. But, in theory, if you're running for office against a very well-known celebrity, you have an uphill battle.
Governor Gray Davis, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Now, for another perspective, we're joined by Lan Hee Chen, former senior policy advisor to Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney. Lan Hee's a Republican candidate for the office of California State Controller next year. Lan Hee, welcome back to Planet America.
Great to be with you again. Thank you.
Lan Hee, at a time with this much polarisation, should it be this easy to get rid of a governor just 12 months before an election?
Well, look, I think that what drove the situation we're seeing now in California was a tremendous amount of voter frustration. Now, we can argue about whether, in fact, the threshold should be higher in terms of the number of signatures. I referred to the petition that it required to get this question onto the public vote in the first place. Should that threshold be higher? Should there be a higher threshold that a candidate has to meet in order to replace the governor? Those are all definitely fair questions. But the fundamentals of this situation, Chad, I think it's important to remember that there were millions of Californians from all political parties who signed this petition to put this vote before the people of California. Arguably, they could have done it at the next regularly scheduled election, which is, of course, next year. But fundamentally, so many people were upset about what was going on that they signed this petition, and this is where we find ourselves now. So, again, I think there are ways the process could potentially be changed to avoid some of these quirkier outcomes. But at the end of the day, the process is what we have. It was followed in this case, and Gavin Newsom is going to have to fight for his political life here over the next month.
Do you feel that Newsom's in danger because of COVID frustration, or is he really that much on the nose in California?
Yeah, I think the frustration began around his handling of COVID, the shutdowns, which we had in California. Not so much the shutdowns, but a lack of really communicating about why things were happening, what the data was supporting those things. There was, of course, this incident where the governor showed up for a very fancy dinner at a very good Napa Valley restaurant, showed up unmasked with a bunch of lobbyists and had this dinner with a $1,000 wine bill. People got very upset and torqued about what they perceived to be the hypocrisy of the governor, the COVID handling. And then I also think fundamentally underlying this, Chaz, there is a disaffection with how some things are going in California. The cost of living is very high. We always have wildfires year after year. This year we have a wildfire burning in the northern part of the state, the so-called Dixie Fire, that's already claimed a number of homes and millions of acres. So all of these challenges we have in California, I think at core, have driven people to want to express their frustration and to want change. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this recall at this point in time.
Now, according to polls, Newsom is doing measurably worse amongst Hispanic voters than he is amongst white voters or black voters or Asian voters. Why do you think that is?
I think a lot of that is what's happening with the economy in California, cost of living issues. I think many, for example, Latino small business owners were hurt by the lockdowns. They really have not been able to come back fully since those lockdowns were lifted earlier this year. You have continuing issues in the economy and job markets. The cost of living, as I noted earlier, is exceptionally high energy costs, high input costs for a variety of different resources that people consume here in California. So I think it's really a story of the economy and people struggling to make ends meet in California and frustration about that. I would combine that, by the way, with some of the challenges we have in California now on public safety. I think what we're seeing, maybe some of your viewers have seen the footage of people that just walk into the middle of stores in San Francisco, take what they want and leave because they know they're not going to be prosecuted or face criminal liability for what they've done. And I do think that the public safety issues, the idea that people just don't feel as safe in their communities anymore. I think that's another reason why you're seeing some of this disaffection in Hispanic communities throughout California. But whatever the reasons are, it's such a crucial voting population in California. Hispanic voters make up such a significant percentage of California voters and those who will turn out in this election that Newsom's challenges with that group are particularly problematic for him.
Lanhee Chen, thanks for visiting Plain America.
Thanks, guys.
There's one Democratic state governor with even bigger problems than Gavin Newsom right now, and that, of course, is New York's Andrew Cuomo, who has been accused of sexual harassment by 11 women. This week, facing calls to resign from the president on down, 4 criminal investigations and almost certain impeachment by his fellow Empire State Democrats, Cuomo bowed to the inevitable, announcing he will leave office in 2 weeks. But he still is really not admitting that he did anything wrong, merely apologising for offending the women.
I thought a hug and putting my arm around a staff person while taking a picture was friendly, but she found it to be too forward. I kissed a woman on the cheek at a wedding, and I thought I was being nice, but she felt that it was too aggressive. I have slipped and called people honey, sweetheart, and darling. I meant it to be endearing, but women found it dated and offensive.
I made a mistake by being too nice to people. I'm just an old-fashioned guy, out of touch with the times.
In my mind, I've never crossed the line with anyone, but I didn't realize the extent to which the line has been redrawn.
Damn that line! Somebody redrew the line.
So hard to see that line. Look, my favourite Cuomo grab has got to be this one. Talk about laying it on thick.
New York tough means New York loving. And I love New York. And I love you. And everything I have ever done has been motivated by that love. And I would never want to be unhelpful in any way. And I think that given the circumstances, the best way I can help now is if I step aside and let government get back to governing. Because as we say, it's not about me, it's about we.
He's just all about love, John. that was the problem.
It was so awkward. Meanwhile, President Biden welcomed Cuomo's resignation, and while he wouldn't defend his behaviour, he did heap praise on Cuomo's achievements in office.
How would you assess his 10.5 years as governor of the state?
In terms of his personal behavior or what he's done as a governor?
Done as a governor.
I thought he's done a hell of a job. And I mean, both on everything from access to voting to infrastructure, to a whole range of things. That's why it's so sad.
Yeah, just remember that line they redrew? A hell of a job, so sad he's going. Really?
Can you really say that he has done, quote, hell of a job if he's accused of sexually harassing women?
Look, you asked 2 different questions. I asked the substantive, should he remain as governor, is one question. And women should be believed when they make accusations that are able to, on the face of them, make sense and investigate it. They're investigated, and the judgment was made that what they said was correct. That's one thing. The question is, did he do a good job on infrastructure? That was the question.
Now, to be fair, Chaz, the original question sort of meandered along for about 30 seconds. They started talking about infrastructure, just trying to segue into the kind of personal stuff about Cuomo. So Biden's sort of right about that, but it could have been phrased a heck of a lot better. Expect that to be in a Republican attack ad or two. Cuomo, meanwhile, is going to be replaced at the end of the month by his fairly low-profile Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, a more conservative Democrat who will now serve out Cuomo's term at least until next year's gubernatorial election.
Kathy Hochul stepping out from Andrew Cuomo's shadow.
I want people to know that I'm ready for this.
The lieutenant governor will replace the besieged Cuomo on August 24th. Hochul today promising she'll be a different kind of leader.
No one will ever describe my administration as a toxic work environment.
Ooh, nice little parting shot from Kathy Hochul, who becomes the first female governor in the history of the state of New York. And reportedly, she hasn't spoken to Andrew Cuomo once for for 6 months. She is his Lieutenant Governor, and she's already saying that she plans to run for a full term next year. It's fair to say that not a lot of people in New York politics are going to miss Andrew Cuomo. He was a brash bully, and it turns out he was also a creepy, gropey kind of guy. And the question now is whether he has done some kind of deal to make those criminal investigations go away. Why is he hanging around for 14 days? Ultimately, the call on that legally rests with Attorney General Tish James, who may well herself be running for governor next year against Kathy Hochul. So maybe this doesn't all end now.
Intriguing. Look, just on that clip of Biden before, though, saying Cuomo did a hell of a job, obviously that is going to get taken out of context, like you say, and it was kind of a lame question from the reporter as well, I have to say. But even what Biden actually meant was kind of odd. Forget Cuomo's personal behaviour for a second. Just as a governor, he set up a commission to root out corruption in state politics. But then he deeply compromised their work, objecting whenever the commission got too close to Cuomo himself, and then he disbanded them halfway through their investigation. Then, as governor, he implemented the bizarre rule which compelled nursing homes to take recovering COVID patients from hospitals and may well have led to hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths. And then, as governor, his people underreported the nursing home COVID death toll by as much as 50%. And then, as governor, he chose to write a self-glorifying book about his handling of the pandemic halfway through the pandemic itself, and is now being investigated for getting junior staff members and senior aides to edit drafts for him, sitting on pitch meetings and perform menial book-related tasks for him for free. And I'm just scratching the surface here, John. We only go for half an hour. His record as governor is far from spotless, so I'm not sure what Biden's playing out there. As for Cuomo, though, the story is not quite over yet, because the woman known as Executive Assistant 1 in Letitia James's report, the woman who accused Cuomo of groping her breast, has also filed a criminal complaint against him, and she's also gone public.
These were not hugs that he would give his mother or, his brother. These were hugs with the intention of getting some personal sexual satisfaction out of. Then they started to be hugs with kisses on the cheek. And then there was at one point a hug. And then when he went to go kiss me on the cheek, he quickly turned his head and he kissed me on the lips. Maybe to him that he thought this was normal, but to me and the other women that he did this to, it was not normal. It was not welcomed, and it was certainly not consensual.
So the Cuomo story is far from complete, and this story ain't been edited by his staffers.
Yeah, it has been a historic and precipitous fall from grace for Andrew Cuomo. In April, May last year, plenty of Democrats were saying Cuomo should be their presidential nominee, not Joe Biden, and now it's all come tumbling down. Our next guest was one of Barack Obama's closest foreign policy advisors and speechwriters. Ben Rhodes served for all 8 years in the Obama White House as Deputy National Security Advisor. He wrote about that experience in his first book, The World as It Is, in 2018. His new book is called After the Fall, Being American in the World We Have Made, part gap year travelogue. It's an unvarnished examination of the rise of autocratic figures around the world, including Donald Trump, and the extent to which American policy decisions are responsible for the erosion of global democracy. Ben Rhodes, welcome back to Planet America.
Good to see you again.
Ben, it seemed as though, on the one hand, you're trying to figure out how did Donald Trump happen, but at the same time also trying to identify the fact that he wasn't necessarily a uniquely American thing to have happened.
Yeah, I mean, the jumping off point for me for this book was a conversation I had with a Hungarian in Germany. I asked this young activist, how did your country go from being essentially a democracy to a single-party autocracy in a decade? And he said, look, it's quite simple. Viktor Orban, our prime minister, was elected in a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis. He redrew the parliamentary districts to entrench his party in power. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote. He enriched some cronies on the outside who financed his politics and then bought up the media and turned it into kind of a far-right propaganda machine. And he wrapped this whole project up in an us versus them nationalism, us, the real Hungarians, against them, liberal elites, George Soros, Muslims, immigrants. And he could have been describing the experience of the direction the Republican Party had taken leading up to and through Trump. And also I realized that the playbook he described is one that we've seen leaders use in many other countries, including, I think, originating in some ways from Vladimir Putin's power grab in Russia. And so what I began to discover as I looked at all these different places in which democracy was threatened is these weren't all separate trends. They were connected. They were a part of a single megatrend that was really shaping the politics of the world in ways that I felt, particularly the later Obama years, but certainly acutely in America through the Trump years.
Ben, often when trying to identify big global trends or things happening domestically or internationally from an American viewpoint, it's tempting to examine history or to look at other examples around the world as you have. I wonder, which do you think are the most instructive?
Well, I think it's still to be written, but I had an eerie experience that I described in China, where I was in Shanghai in 2017 traveling with former President Obama. I get woken up in my hotel room in the middle of the night by two Chinese officials who were there to warn me that Barack Obama, the former president, should not meet the Dalai Lama on an upcoming trip to India. And what was particularly alarming, other than being woken up, is that we hadn't announced that trip or that visit. I'd just been put in email contact with the Dalai Lama's representative. They were not shy about letting me know that they were monitoring somebody's email. And I remember walking outside and looking at the Shanghai skyline, which kind of looks like the future. It looks like lights everywhere, kind of a Blade Runner feeling to it. People are taking selfies. And what occurred to me and what I really investigated in writing the book is very much the direction of events suggests that the future looks more like China. And if you looked at the Chinese Communist Party today and the way that they blended together capitalism and technology in this kind of totalitarian model, really, if you take the 30 years of American hegemony in the world and you stripped out the democracy and you just had the hyper-focus on profit and the hyper-focus on technology and the hyper-focus on national security, there's kind of a logical progression from American leadership to China's growing influence. And so to me, the warning that I took from Hong Kong in particular is the future direction of events right now. It feels like the momentum around the world is in the direction of the kind of model that the Chinese Communist Party represents. I don't think that's any way preordained, in part because this book covers really a 30-year period beginning at the end of the Cold War when everybody thought the opposite. Everybody thought that the future was inevitably going to be open societies and democracy. Ultimately, we have agency. We have choices to make, and particularly in America, we have choices to make right now about whether to preserve our democracy or whether to continue this kind of authoritarian drift that we've seen in our politics.
Ben, for a long time, the United States has seen itself as being a country possessing manifest destiny, the indispensable nation, the shining city on the hill. Do you think it's had a dose of humility as a result of the Trump era and its loss of international prestige? Has America changed as a result?
Yeah, my plea to Americans really with this book, and very much to a global audience from an American perspective, is to understand that the American exceptionalism that we kind of took for granted. I came of age politically in the 90s, right at the end of the Cold War. You think that democracy is preordained. You think that progress is preordained. But the reality is what we've learned as Americans, what we should have learned, particularly the last 4 years, is that things can happen in America that happen in any country. I mean, I remember, after Trump was elected, I had plenty of people in other countries say to me, well, now you know what it's like to have the corrupt autocrat with the son-in-law down the hall. Many countries have had violent mobs storm their parliaments. Things are happening in America right now that are not that unusual around the world, but that we Americans are not accustomed to. And I worry that even now, there's the sigh of relief that many of us breathed when Joe Biden was elected, but Donald Trump is waiting in the wings, and the Republican Party has only grown more radical since Joe Biden's election. We're not out of these woods yet. And I think if we look at the fact that this kind of authoritarian strain of politics is taking hold in so many places around the world, that too should be a warning to us that we're not immune to things happening in America that we never would have imagined as recently as a decade ago.
So in that 30-year sweep or so from the end of the Cold War through until the present day that you identify in this book, I wonder, what do you think were the landmark moments, those inflection points, the decisions that were taken, the things that were done that really made a difference?
I think there were a few turning points that I kind of identify in the sense that I think 9/11 was one. I think America had been a country without a unifying sense of purpose after the Cold War. And after 9/11, President Bush kind of marshaled that desire for really a national identity and purpose in the world to this project of fighting terrorism. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we became massively overextended in that effort. And the Iraq War was a huge blow to not just American credibility, but to democracy itself, because democracy was kind of enlisted as a rationale for that war after the real rationale, weapons of mass destruction, turned out not to be true. But what I also look at in this book is how much the 2008 financial crisis was a seismic event that rippled out around the world. One Hong Kong official said to me, anonymous official, look, 2008 is when the narrative of liberalism and democracy collapsed in the West. And it's when the Chinese Communist Party kind of looked around and said, well, why are we deferring to the Americans on the stewardship of the international system? Maybe we should assert ourselves a little bit more aggressively at home and in places like Hong Kong and around the world. And I think if you look at this rise of particularly right-wing populism in places like Hungary, that I look at closely in the book, the financial crisis was central to someone like Viktor Orban coming along and saying, all of American-led globalization is to blame. Liberal democracy itself has failed. We should turn to something else, something in some ways more familiar because it's older, which is kind of a blood and soil nationalism. And this nationalism that we've seen through Brexit, that we've seen through people like Viktor Orban, that we've seen in every part of the world really, took hold very much, I think, after the 2008 financial crisis. And if we're honest again as Americans, that was a part of our own excesses after the Cold War, the kind of unregulated, unbridled capitalism that created the inequality and created the vulnerability that led to the financial crisis. So to me, 9/11 and the financial crisis are really the two signal events in this 30-year period. And they're also the events that during my years in the White House, I felt very acutely that we were kind of trying to clean up the mess that had been left behind by those events.
In that time frame, of course, Ben, we've seen America have a series of, I guess, setbacks or at least reality checks on the extents and limits to its power. We're seeing what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment as the US withdraws and the Taliban, who's been biding their time, are moving back in. I wonder, does America even have a leadership role? Is America leading in the world in the same way today?
Well, I think so, absolutely. And as someone who is willing to be self-critical in this book, I also deeply believe that the United States being able to succeed and set an example as a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy is actually more important today than it has been in recent memory. And the United States continues to be the only country that can rally collective action among the world's democracies, whether it's Europe or Australia, Japan, other countries around the world. And also there's an opportunity in a way, in the sense that, as I was talking about earlier, America has shown that things can happen here, like a mob storming the parliament, that makes us look less exceptional to the world. Well, actually, if America can fight through that, if we can fight through our own spasm of this strain of authoritarian nationalism and come out stronger on the other end, and that's going to take some time, I think that will set a powerful example to other countries around the world about how they might do that. That in some ways, someone used to write speeches for a president, just giving speeches about democracy from the mountaintop of being a superpower is almost less powerful than if we, as a country that in some ways, as the title of my book suggests, has fallen from that position, if we can fight our way through that, I think that will be an essential example at a time when you do have in Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia, never mind a host of other leaders we could talk about, you have real challenges to democracy.
Ben Rhodes, good to talk to you again. Thanks for being with us on Planet America.
Thanks so much. Great talking.
It's the economy, stupid.
Well, it's nice to have a segment title, kind of. July's unemployment figures are in, and they were good. 943,000 jobs added in July. That's the best gain in 11 months, meaning that America has regained the vast majority of the 22 million jobs they lost during the pandemic. They're now 5.7 million jobs down. Although, if you follow the trend line from before the pandemic, they're really about 9 million jobs below where they should be at this point in time. Similarly, the unemployment rate fell this month from 5.8% to 5.4%. A solid result, but it's still a fair bit back from 3.5%, which is where unemployment was before the pandemic. fine. But the good news didn't end there. 465,000 people working part-time because of slack business conditions got full-time work in July as well. And wage growth for general workers was a very healthy 4.7%. Although, admittedly, the last few months that wage growth has been chewed up by inflation. That's for another segment. One sector of note has been the leisure and hospitality sector. It had a pretty tough pandemic, but it's bouncing back now, representing about 40% of the total job growth last month. Not only are there a heap more jobs opening up in the leisure and hospitality sector at a far higher rate than the rest of the economy, but the wages for those leisure and hospitality sector jobs are also rising at a far higher rate, as you can see. That is all good news. So what's not good news? Well, firstly, all those numbers were taken from surveys that finished in the second week of July, which is just when the Delta variant took off. So August's numbers might not be so wonderful. Secondly, all these extra jobs were filled by people already in the workforce. Not so many people came off the sidelines to join the workforce. If you look at the participation rate for the labour force, people left the workforce in droves when the pandemic hit, but they simply have not come back. It's flatlined. And the third negative is an odd deviation. It's in teenage unemployment. White and Latino unemployment are in sync, but black teenage unemployment rose 4% last month. Now, personally, I just think that's a glitch in the numbers, correcting for an unusually rapid drop in black teenage unemployment there. But I thought I should flag it anyway as something to keep an eye on in the future. Finally, we should check in on the question that we've been asking all year, which is, do we see any evidence that the super generous pandemic unemployment benefits made any difference to unemployment? Because, 26 states ended their pandemic unemployment bonuses before this survey period. So theoretically, if they made any difference, we should see that here. I don't know, 782,000 people dropping off the unemployment rolls, that's consistent with people rushing back to work when they lose unemployment benefits. But there were also huge numbers dropping off the unemployment rolls in May and June as well, before these unemployment benefits ended. Also, if people were suddenly desperate to get jobs, would there really be such a massive rise in job openings? 10.1 million, that's a record. Presumably a lot of those jobs would have been filled. So at least so far, I'm not convinced. We'll see if the picture is any clearer when next we visit...
It's the economy, stupid.
We're just about out of time, Chaz. In fact, no time to even bother lighting the fake fire. But there is a lot of news that we'll flag probably for next week's show, because this week saw major military advances by the Taliban in Afghanistan as feared. The US withdrawal is all but complete. The Afghan government, though, is struggling to hang on to major cities, including the likes of Kandahar. In Kabul itself, the United States has just announced in the last few hours that it is sending 3,000 new troops in, not to defend the capital, just to try and secure the embassy and remove embassy staff. They don't want another Benghazi on their hands. They're even talking about maybe moving the embassy itself into Kabul airport as a provisional thing. I mean, if this doesn't look like Saigon 1975, I don't know what does. And as for that story that we've been following about what happens to the 50,000 or so Afghan interpreters and their families who've been working very closely with the American forces over 20 years and are being threatened by the Taliban with reprisals and possible death, well, they're out of luck, because there aren't going to be seats on the planes for a lot of them. Real concerns that those visa holders are going to be left behind.
It's not a great sign if they need to defend the embassy with 3,000 troops.
No.
Also, I think next week a big story is building as well, which is on immigration, on the people crossing the border. The new figures have been delayed and delayed and delayed. The preliminary figures were over 210,000 border crosses in July. Bear in mind, that's the peak of summer, when normally the numbers are much lower because it's too hot for them to cross. Those are record numbers. We're looking at possibly an all-time record for this year. Things are getting out of control on that border, and I don't think Biden knows what he's doing. So we'll probably be covering that next week as well.
Yes, and the Afghan refugee crisis on top of that, as well as everything else. So he wanted to be president for 70 years. You got it, Joe Biden. But that's it for another week. A real treat for you next time, though. We're going to start counting down the best and worst presidents of all time with Countdown's Gavin Wood.
You can find us on iView, Facebook and YouTube, and I'm going to have a pet podcast in all the usual pod places right there. See you later.
Bye-bye.